Good morning. In our lecture today, we are going to talk about macroeconomics, or this lecture is just an introduction about macroeconomics, what's meant by macroeconomics, and the three main objectives of any country. So, as we said before, that economics has two main branches: microeconomics and macroeconomics. Microeconomics is concerned with studying the economic behavior for a single individual, single firm, or single market. So it's concerned with studying the economic behavior for a single entity. For example, we are going to study the price of a specific commodity. Or demand for a specific products or quantities bought or sold of a specific product. So it is just concerned with single unit, whether individual, this individual can be consumer or producer, or a single product or market. What about macroeconomics? Macroeconomics is concerned with studying the economic behavior on an aggregate level or overall level of the country. So instead of focusing on the quantity produced of a specific product, we are going to talk about the national output level. Instead of talking about the price of a specific commodity, we are going to talk about the general price level, etc. Any country has three main macroeconomic objectives. Number one, to increase level of output, or in other words, to increase economic growth rate. Number two, to increase employment level, or in other words, decrease unemployment. Objective number three is to keep prices stable. We are going to talk about each one of them in details. Let's start with objective number one, which is high level of output and rapid economic growth. Level of output is measured by something known as gross domestic product. or GDP. Gross domestic product means is the market value of all final goods and services produced in a country during a specific period of time. Usually 1 year. GDP can be measured in terms of the actual market price or a constant price. So we have to differentiate between two new concepts, real GDP and nominal GDP. So it can be measured using actual market price or current market price, or constant or base year prices. This is known as nominal GDP. And if you are going to keep prices constant, this will be real GDP. We are going to use real GDP in order to achieve the objective, which is increasing economic growth rate. So we would like to measure growth rate using real GDP instead of nominal GDP, as real GDP shows the change in production or the quantity produced while keeping the prices constant. So if there is an increase in real GDP, economic growth rate will increase as well. So economic growth rates or GDP growth rate is measured as real GDP this year or at time t minus real GDP in the previous year or in the last year or t minus 1 divided by real GDP at time t minus 1 multiplied by 100. Also, we have to differentiate between actual production level and maximum production level, or in other words, GDP and or actual GDP and potential GDP. So what's meant by potential GDP? Potential GDP is the maximum amount the economy can produce with stable prices, given that all resources are fully utilized. Is the maximum amount the economy can produce with stable prices using all available resources. So potential GDP is determined by the amount of countries' productive capacity of land, labor, capital, and technology. The difference between actual and potential GDP is known as GDP gap. Actually, during business cycle, actual GDP departs from potential GDP. They are not equivalent to each other. So what's meant by business cycle and what are the main phases of a business cycle? Business cycle means fluctuations in real GDP or ups and downs in real GDP. This is a business cycle. Business cycle has two main phases. And two main turning points. Phase number one is expansion. And in case of expansion, real GDP is going to increase. So this is phase number one. Real GDP is going to increase. So this is expansion. Phase number two is recession. And in this phase, real GDP is going to decrease. During expansion, the gap between actual and the potential GDP is small, while during a recession, there is a large gap between actual and potential GDP. So, GDP gap during expansion is small, while GDP gap during a recession is large. The highest point of the business cycle is known as peak, while the lowest point or the minimum point is known as trough. A very deep recession is known as depression. Now let's take a numerical example on how to calculate real GDP and nominal GDP. Let's assume that this is the data related to the production in a country during two different time periods. This country produces 3 commodities: food, housing, and machine. This is the price and the quantity for the 2 years. The 2 years are 2012 and 2013. Required is to calculate nominal GDP and real GDP for year 2013 and calculate the GDP growth rate in year 2013. Number 1, calculate nominal GDP for year 2012 and 2013. GDP for year 2012, nominal GDP, is calculated as summation of price multiplied by the quantity, current year prices multiplied by current year quantities. So it is 12 multiplied by 4 for food, plus 9 multiplied by 3 for housing, plus 20 multiplied by 2 for machines. So the total is 115. We are going to do the same for year 2013, which is calculated as current year prices multiplied by current year quantities. So it is 14 multiplied by 5 plus 10 multiplied by 3 plus 20 multiplied by 2. So GDP for year 2013 will be 140. Now we have to calculate real GDP for year 2012 and 2013. If you know that the base year is year 2012, given that so we are going to use base year prices and current year quantities for year 2012. For year 2012 is the base year and the current year as well. So in this case, real GDP will be calculated as 12 multiplied by 4 plus 9 multiplied by 3 plus 20 multiplied by 2. So real GDP will be 115. So we can conclude that for the base year, real GDP equals nominal GDP. Now we have to calculate it for year 2013. For year 2013, real GDP will be calculated as base year prices multiplied by current year quantities. So we are going to use prices of year 2012 multiplied by quantities of year 2013. So it's 12 multiplied by 5 plus 9 multiplied by 3 plus 20 multiplied by 2. So in this case, real GDP will be 127. So this is real GDP for year 2013. Now we are going to use real GDP to calculate GDP growth rates for year 2013. It's calculated as real GDP at time t, or year 2013, minus real GDP at time t minus 1, or in the previous or last year, which is 2012, divided by real GDP at time t minus 1, which is 2012, multiplied by 100. Real GDP for year 2013 is 127, and for year 2012 is 115, divided by 115, multiplied by 100. So GDP growth rate is 10.4%. So from this we can conclude that real GDP for the base year equal nominal GDP in this year. This is with respect to objective number 1. Objective number 2. Objective number 2 is high employment or low unemployment. People from 16 to 64 who are willing and able to work, known as labor force. Labor force in every country is divided into two main parts: employed people and unemployed people. Policymakers are concerned with the unemployment rate and they would like to decrease unemployment rate. Sorry. So unemployment rate is calculated as number of unemployed people divided by labor force multiplied by 100. For example, if you know that employed people in a country equal 96 and unemployed people equals 4. Required is to find labor force number 1. Number 2 is to calculate unemployment rate. Labor force is calculated as the summation of employed people and unemployed people. So it's 96 plus 4, which is 100. Then we have to calculate unemployment rate as number of unemployed people, which is 4, divided by labor force, which is 100, multiplied by 100. So unemployment rate is 4% in this case. There are three main types for unemployment. Number 1, fractional unemployment. Fractional unemployment is due to normal labor turnover. You would like to find a better job, so you are going to leave your job right now to search for a higher position, a higher salary. So this is known as normal labor turnover. Number 2 is structural unemployment. And this is due to technological improvement and low-skilled workers. Now there is an improvement in technology and we are going to buy a new machine. Workers are not going to be able to use this machine, so they are going to leave their job, or they are going to be laid off of their job. This is structural unemployment. Number 3, cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is related to business cycle. During recession, as we said, there is a decrease in real GDP. As a result, output is going to decrease, as people are not going to increase production, so they are going to lay off workers out of their job. So this is due to recession in business cycle. During the expansion, real GDP increased, which means that production will increase. So, as we would like to increase production, we are going to hire more workers, so cyclical unemployment is going to decrease or maybe zero. What about objective number 3? Objective number 3 is to keep prices stable. Stable prices, here we are not going to take a price for a specific commodity. It is related to the general price level. When we are going to talk about general price level, so general price level will be measured using two different indicators. CPI, or Consumer Price Index, or GDP deflator. So CPI and GDP deflator are indicators or proxies for the general price level. CPI is the cost of a basket of goods such as food, shelter, clothing, or others, bought by average urban consumer. Is the cost of a basket of goods that are bought by average urban consumer. We are going to use CPI or GDP deflator to calculate inflation rate. Inflation means an increase in the general price level. So, how to calculate GDP deflator? GDP deflator is calculated as nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. We are going to use CPI or GDP deflator to calculate inflation. Inflation is calculated as CPI for the current year or at time t minus CPI at time t minus 1 or in the last year divided by CPI at time t minus 1 multiplied by 100. And the same if you are going to use GDP deflator, it will be GDP deflator at time t or in the current year minus GDP deflator at time t minus 1 divided by GDP deflator at time t minus 1 multiplied by 100. For the base year, GDP deflator will be 100 and CPI will be 100 as well. If after calculation of inflation rate you find that the value is positive, this means that there is an inflation. If the value is negative, this means that prices will decrease and this is known as deflation. If you calculate inflation rate and it's very high, say for example 100,000%, so in this case this is known as hyperinflation. What are the main causes of inflation? There are two main theories that explain increase in inflation rate. Number one, demand pull, and number two, cost push. In case of demand pull, if the economy is at full employment level, or in other words, on PPF, on PPF, means that all our resources are fully utilized. So in this case, if there is an increase in demand, we cannot increase production, but there is an increase in the price level. This is demand push. What about cost push? Cost push means that price of resources or price of factors of production is going to increase. So firms try to pass on this increase to the product price. Firms are going not to cover this increase in costs by increasing price of the commodity. So these are the two main causes of increase in inflation rate. Usually policymakers would like to use different policies in order to control or achieve the three main objectives, which are increase in production level, increase in employment level, and keep prices stable. So what are the different policies that can be used by policymakers? Mainly we are going to talk about two main policies. Number one, fiscal policy, and number two, monetary policy. In case of fiscal policy, the government has two main tools that can be used. Number one, government expenditure, which is government purchases of goods and services. Government spending on goods and services. And number two is taxes. So if you would like to increase economic growth rate, we can increase government expenditure or spending on goods and services, or decrease taxes so people can be able to buy more goods and services. What about monetary policy? In case of monetary policy is under the control of the central bank. Central bank will determine money supply, which is amount of money in the hand of the public. So tool number one is money supply. Number two is interest rates and credit. So what's money supply? Money supply. So let's talk about the two narrowest definition of money. The narrowest one is known as, of money supply, is known as M1. M1 consists of paper money and coins, in the hand of the public, plus demand or checkable deposits. Checkable deposits are deposits in which you can write checks. A broader definition of money supply is M2, which is M1 plus saving deposits. The central bank can affect interest rate and money supply in order to affect interest rates, investment and GDP. So say for example, if the central bank decrease money supply, interest rate is going to increase and investment will decrease and GDP will decrease and vice versa. So this means that the government can use either monetary policy or fiscal policy in order to affect GDP and achieve the three main objectives. This is the end of our lecture today. Thank you and see you next week.